King's Landing has fallen to the tyrant queen of Dragonstone, or it's been reclaimed by the righteous ruler of all of Westeros, depending on who you ask, although it does sometimes feel like House of the Dragon is very much on Rhaenyra's side. House of the Dragon tells the story of a dragon rider civil war, but you would be forgiven for not knowing where every dragon and army and important battle and all the people are. So, let's look at a map. Team Black has taken King's Landing, the capital of the Seven Kingdoms, but we see in this episode the city is just plagued with problems. It is not the romantic return to the throne that Rhaenyra had hoped for that we often see in fantasy. No, Tywin Lannister split up the crown's gold into 4 parts and sent it all over the place, so there is no money. Now, in the show, you don't quite know where the money is, so this is a minor spoiler, but honestly, it's really not that much, and if you just think about it for a second, you can probably figure it out. 1 part is sent to the Lannisters over in the Westerlands, 1 part is sent to the Iron Bank of Braavos, 1 part was sent to Old Town, the home of the Hightowers, and the last bit was kept in King's Landing for bribes and sellswords and just smoothing over their whole seizing of the throne and their coup. But most of that is just gone. There's just no money left. So Rhaenyra arrives and wants to rule, but literally can't. This is a city on the brink of starvation after months of their blockade preventing food from coming in. They're begging for help, for food, for fleece, for any kind of meat, and she wants to help, but there is nothing she can do, it seems. She wants a coronation, but can't. We also see how the Red Keep is overrun with rats now, because Aegon had all of the rat catchers killed after Daemon murdered his kid. So much of the Dance of the Dragons is about how all of this war and violence is senseless and pointless and a waste. It's just blood spilt, right? But it's also about how war degrades the very society you live in. It destroys the institutions and the functions. When the people in power are obsessed with violence and vengeance rather than actually running a society, it just decays everything until eventually you don't even have a society that can support the war you wanted to wage in the first place. And we'll see where that goes. Eventually, it lets the rats in. Beginning of the episode, Rhaenyra has this ominous line where she says, "The air is thick with ghosts." She's just returned to King's Landing and she looks around and she can see her childhood memories, her past, her father. And this line struck me as a quote, a reference to something. House of the Dragon has done this a couple of times before, you can kind of feel it out. And it might be a reference to a play by Henrik Ibsen called Ghosts. I actually went and saw a different play by Henrik Ibsen called An Enemy of the People, which starred Matt Smith, by the way. But anyways, Ghosts features like incest and euthanasia and a whole bunch of taboo stuff in 19th century society. The whole play is kind of this critique of the underpinning moral philosophy of that society, saying, hey, this doesn't work. It's not a good thing, it's destroying us, it's gonna just decay society over time. And the term ghosts in the original language is a pun to refer to events which keep repeating themselves. And thematically, this is just very on brand for House of the Dragon and the whole book, Fire and Blood, not just because of the incest. The whole dance is just this never-ending bloody cycle of events which repeat themselves. A son for a son, vengeance for vengeance, you know, Daemon's bloodthirsty ambition gets mirrored in Aemon's bloodthirsty ambition. But the whole story is also kind of a critique of the core tenet of Targaryen philosophy that they are better, that they are closer to the gods, you know? Because in this war, we see that they aren't. We see that they are just as prone to the same vices as the rest of us, that they're not inherently wiser. There's no real material difference between someone like Hugh the Hammer and Rhaenyra or Daemon. Aemon gets stabbed in the kidney just as much as an ordinary person would, and if dragons make them special, well suddenly they're exactly the same as someone like Hugh the Hammer, a commoner, and we're told over and over, especially in the TV series, but also in Fire and Blood, like it is there, but maybe a little bit less stated, that, hey, it's a myth that they control the dragons. Over and over we see that a world built on this abstract idea of Targaryen greatness is a fragile one. A world built on fire and blood is a failed one. There's a line in a review for the play Ghosts which really struck me in saying, this focus on the past from which there is no escape gives these plays a sense of constriction, of being trapped in a machine that cannot be anything other than infernal. The Iron Throne, that Targaryen philosophy and way of ruling, is an infernal machine. In this episode, Alicent tells Rhaenyra, hey, if you're going to take the Iron Throne, you're going to do things which are terrible. You're going to become someone different. And Rhaenyra protests. She's like, hey, I don't need to become someone that I am not. I don't need to be cruel and sadistic and domineering and fire and blood and all of that. But if she's trapped in that machine, and if that machine is infernal, then maybe that is what she will become. Maybe that is what she will choose to become to remain in it. The past is always controlling the present, and we see this in, Otto and Viserys, and also Corlys's mistakes. These three men whose whole families get just torn apart because of their problems. It gets passed down to their kids and to their kids. And in the books, it's a lot more emphasized that this is like a multi-generational story, that this unfolds over generations, that the violence gets passed down from person to person. In the show, they compress the timelines quite a lot, so it doesn't quite have that sort of multi-generational element that I really love in the Fire and Blood book. But either way, if this is a reference, it's very cool. If it's not, it's still a cool tidbit, and it fits in very coincidentally. In the Riverlands, most of Team Green's Lannister army has been basically destroyed. Now, in the books, the Lannisters are also getting attacked by the Ironborn on the coast, so they're just having a really bad time. But Team Black's army is on the march towards King's Landing, and Aemond and Vhagar, the largest dragon in the war, have burned Harrenhal and then disappeared. To where? We don't know, but the last person to see him was Alice Rivers, this weird old magic witch woman who can give people character arc dreams. And there's this question, hey, if she can make Daemon into someone who's, thinking about things beyond himself, can she do that with Aemond? We don't know, we shall see. Criston Cole also has a much smaller army of about 4,000 people in the area. We don't know exactly where, but they seem to be on some kind of collision course. At the same time, a host of 15,000 Hightower men are marching up from Old Town, along with Daeron Targaryen and the dragon Tessarion. Now, Tessarion is pretty small. If I remember correctly, she's basically the smallest dragon in this war who is still capable of fighting, because there are a bunch of dragons which are smaller as well. Point is, she's the kind of dragon who's very useful if there aren't other dragons around. So in the books, the Hightower army is marching up from Old Town, and they keep on getting attacked, but then they win because, Tessarion helps them out. And then they force everyone to surrender and to join their army. So it swells up to, I think, like 40,000 people or something. In this episode, we see Aemond Hightower pretend to bend the knee and surrender to Daemon, to hand over Daeron as a hostage. But it's a trick. He's a decoy. And after Daemon and his dragons all fly away, Aemond moves on and takes Tumbleton, which is a tiny little market town. It's not particularly important in the grand scheme of Westerosi history, but it is very important for the Dance of Dragons. Now, I gotta be honest, it was a little bit odd that they didn't take Tessarion with them, or they didn't ask Daeron to fly with Tessarion. They wouldn't want them to have the dragon, I would assume. But of course, maybe they really wanted that scene where Alicent doesn't recognize the kid and Rhaenyra figures it out, and so they wanted to hold that reveal until later. I don't know. Whatever. Alternatively, maybe they were intentionally separating Daeron from his dragon. After all, dragons on their own don't tend to be that much of a threat. They're not going to get involved in a war on their own. And if he had the dragon in King's Landing, it might make it easier for him to escape. So maybe that was intentional. We shall see. It's fine, it's just a little thing, just a question. In the books, Tumbleton is a town which is held by the Blacks until the Greens show up and take it. And Rhaenyra is left asking in the show, by the way, why? Why would you try to pull this off? What do you know that I don't? Isn't the war over? Haven't I pretty much won? And I think the point is that Aemond Hightower wants to force Rhaenyra into a dilemma. Into the same dilemma we actually see that Daenerys gets put in Game of Thrones, which is, hey, do I go and burn this town and be seen as a brutal tyrant, or do I hold off and allow this threat to go unpunished, these traitors, and be seen as ineffectual? Aemond and Daeron seem to know that they can't face Rhaenyra's dragons head on, but they can make it politically costly. And optics are an important thing for Rhaenyra, especially because she's trying to build her legitimacy at the moment. Because who is winning this war? This episode is called Rhaenyra Triumphant, and kind of is, right? She has the capital, the Iron Throne, most of the dragons, these hostages, while the Greens are scattered and pretty much leaderless, and their main asset, Aemond and Vhagar, are MIA. I remember how in Season 1 they made a big deal about the Baratheons siding with the Greens instead of the Blacks. Well, around this point in the book, and I say around this point because the timeline is muddled, it's just quite different in the book. I think I prefer the order of events in the book. Either way, around this time, the Baratheons pretty much go, you know what? Maybe we'll go and take care of Dawn for you. Yeah, that's right. We'll take care of the flank. You take care of the dragons up there. We'll take care of these guys back here. Because, you know, most houses don't want to get involved with a war with dragons. Why would they? That's just a terrible idea. They know it. Dragons can burn cities, armies. As the High Septon says in this episode, dragons can destroy but not create. So now Rhaenyra has to fight a different kind of war. A war for gold and a war for loyalty. Now, the book actually spends quite a bit of time on this new phase of the war, and it's actually got some of my favourite little bits of politicking in it. The character Lord Celtigar, who you've seen is like the other guy on Dragonstone who says things to Rhaenyra occasionally, he kind of comes in and he helps to try and figure out some of these money problems. You know, he raises taxes and levies and duties, but he also introduces public executions, which you can pay a few coins to go and see, which is a funny little moment. And these are tactics which will get her gold, but probably lose her loyalty. There's that optics struggle again. You know, in this episode she says, hey, let's go demand tribute from the other houses. Let's get trade up and going, but trade's going to take a long time. You know, the blockade's just been lifted. Daemon has this fantastic line where he says that the need for the poor to eat is a never-ending inconvenience. But the show does seem to be narrowing in on this dilemma for Rhaenyra where she feels like she has to choose between the loyalty of the nobles and the poor. You know, in this episode she gets all of these like middling nobles who didn't really support her, and she feeds them rats at this banquet at the same time as she raids all of their houses, takes all of their food stores, and then distributes out to the poor. It's a temporary gesture, but it gets us some of those loyalty points with one group but not the other. We see in Game of Thrones how Joffrey abandons the poor and almost destroys his rule, but we also see how Daenerys abandons the ruling class and it almost destroys her. You know, she's got all this power, all these dragons, but that sort of finagled politicking of trying to get a city to work like an engine, that's another issue. There's also a conversation in this episode about what Rhaenyra should wear, what it will symbolize, what it will mean. Should she carry a sword? No, that's too warlike. Should she wear jewelry? No, that's ostentatious in a time everyone's been kind of struggling. Let's wear a chain. Now, you'll remember that chains are the things that maesters wear. They're associated with wisdom, with knowledge. She's trying to create the image of wisdom, of authority. This is, I think, the stuff that people actually enjoyed in Game of Thrones, where, you know, people had to think about leading a war in terms of manpower and resources and logistics and optics. Like, there's this understated thing in the background of the A Song of Ice and Fire series, where after the Red Wedding, where the Freys and the Lannisters massacred all of the Starks and all of the Northmen under Guestrite, this was a really taboo thing to do. The Freys are isolated. There's this optics thing that just makes them look terrible. And Tywin also knows that it makes him look terrible. And in fact, his whole family is getting progressively more and more isolated. The optics of that really ruin him in the long term. With that said, I'm not sure some of the subtle optics stuff is quite being consistently used in House of the Dragon. Like, you remember in the first season where Meleys erupted out of the dragon pit and killed a bunch of people? They don't seem to remember that necessarily, or they don't bring that up. She's like trying to get the goodwill of the people again, and that's like not really a factor. It wasn't even that long ago. I don't know what the exact timeline is in the series, but it's got to be within a year or two, right? And overall, there is just like a lot more politicking in the book than we often get in the show. There were some details where I'm always just like, oh, why didn't they do that? Why didn't they do this? You know, why didn't they include this little bit of interesting thing that a character can do that shows that they're smart or wise or thinking about the situation. There are also some other like just weird dynamics which to me don't feel like they've ever been resolved in the series. You know, like remember when Rhaenyra faked killing her husband so she could go and marry Daemon and Laenor could go off to Essos with his boyfriend? She hasn't spoken to Corlys about that. She hasn't even said to him, like, hey, by the way, I didn't murder your son, just so you know. Like, that is insane to me. What is she worried about? That he would go out and try to find him again? That, like, of course that's not gonna happen. Anyways, Rhaenyra is trying to figure out, like, what kind of queen she wants to be. She says that she wants to be judicious but merciful, but what do these words mean? What do they mean in practice? She says that she wants to be like her father, because she has a very rosy memory of him. He was kind and generous and not cruel, and the realm was like at peace, and I'm putting that in very clear quote marks there, you know, but he lacked the stomach for blood and real decision making that ultimately weakened his house, empowered Otto, and led to this split in the family. When she says that he remained himself, the question under that is at what cost to the rest of the realm? I have a pet peeve because I see a lot of people online talking about Martin, and this is especially common in like groups and communities that try to pit Martin against Tolkien for some reason. Well, I know what that reason is, but we're not going to get into that today because that is complicated and frustrating and politically charged. We're just not going to talk about that right now, okay? So these people often say that George R. R. Martin is a pessimist, that he's cynical, that he says that there's like no point in being good. Oh, The Dance of the Dragons is about how awful everyone is. But that's like not really what his writing is about. His writing is about how it's hard to be good. Tywin doesn't win when he kills everyone at the Red Wedding. His whole family is destroyed, pretty much. Like, it is not a good thing that he did for himself and his family there in the end. Martin is all about how being good is complicated. It is difficult. Rhaenyra was not someone who was raised to rule, you know, same as Aegon. So when they're both given power, they don't really know what to do a lot of the time. That is one of her father's mistakes. He was a good man, but that's not the same as being someone who can hold the realm together in a way that's peaceful and prosperous. I thought it was really interesting that in this episode, the only request that Rhaenyra seems to be able to grant to someone is when Alicent comes to her and says, hey, can you let us take Otto's remains back to Old Town so he can rest with his family? And she's like, yeah, you can do that. It's like the only thing she can do, she feels like, is dealing in death, you know? Rhaenyra can kill anyone she wants to, but can she serve the city in the way that she knows she needs to, and that she does want to? And this brings us to kind of a new conflict between Daemon and Rhaenyra, where Daemon goes to her and is like, hey, why are you bothering with all this like tax stuff? You know, we don't need to be accountants. We're so much better than tax people. We could just fly away. We could go and conquer Essos, take another city. Like, there's this city where people have wings that I've heard of. We could just go there. Which, by the way, I had to look that up because I didn't recognize that, a city of people with wings, but it does actually get mentioned in one line of this book, The World of Ice and Fire Atlas, and a couple of other places, but really there's nothing on it. I think the only quote is, there is a city in Yi Ti where people have leathern wings. He speaks to her in Old Valyrian because he's trying to call her back to this mythic belief about themselves and their bloodline and who they are. It's a fantasy of power which Rhaenyra is explicitly rejecting. And I'm going to talk about book Rhaenyra in a second. Don't worry, we're talking about show Rhaenyra right now. Now, she says there is such a thing as too much power. We spoke before about the infernal machine that is the Iron Throne. To some degree, you can almost argue this is like a absolute power corrupts absolutely type theme, but I think it's a little bit more than that. You know, she's trying to set herself apart from that Targaryen philosophy. She doesn't want to just define herself by access to absolute power. She wants to be more than that. Whether she can be is another question. Now, in the books, Rhaenyra is probably a different character. And I say probably because, yes, Fire and Blood is written as a history book, in that it has multiple accounts of the same events, and different narrators have different biases and prejudices and like political leanings and intentions. And so, yeah, like even sometimes they'll be like, yeah, this definitely didn't happen. There's no way we could have known that. They're making it up. Here are the reasons why. And there is definitely an element where, yes, Rhaenyra is probably being framed to be more cruel or tyrannical than she really was. Like, that's probably a part of it. But at the same time, there are definitely, like, through lines of her character which they haven't brought through into the show. They have clearly made her softer and more reluctant. In the books, she's not constantly second-guessing herself or, like, hesitant and afraid of taking bold, even violent action. You know, she immediately claps Alicent in golden chains, kind of mocking her. Again, though, the relationship between Alicent and Rhaenyra is very different in the books. Like, there's also a massive age difference between the two of them, so this was like a fundamental adaptation decision that they made to make Rhaenyra and Alicent closer in age and as characters. In the books, Rhaenyra has a ton of people executed really quickly, so, you know, I think that it's fair to say that book Rhaenyra is a little bit more like Paul Atreides in Dune, you know, where he's taken the throne, he's got kind of this drive, there's a bit more to him going, oomph, grab it, you know? He takes the throne and atrocities are committed in his name, but part of him believes that, maybe they needed to happen, you know? There's a bit more of that in the books. And I think that I actually would have liked, by this point in the story, Rhaenyra to have a bit more of that in her. We'll see where she goes, but we are pretty much like, I think, 10 episodes from the end of the entire story. No, 15 episodes. So the time for her to change and become a different character, it's thinning out. But there are different accounts of how brutal she really is, and they range quite a lot from, like, you know, a bit more benign to very, very cruel, you know. One says that she just warned that she was going to remove someone's tongue, and then another says that actually she just immediately had it removed and then sent these people off to be taken to a brothel and used for 1 dragon coin each. But Book Rhaenyra does share a lot of the same struggles with, like, trying to get the loyalty of the nobles versus the small folk versus other dragon riders. You know, who's more important here? In the books, they talk about stripping the Lannisters and some of the other big houses of their castles and just giving it to Hugh the Hammer and Ulf, because, you know, they're looking for castles, they clearly want them, but they agree that they can't do it and give them some smaller houses. A major theme in the series, and in Fire and Blood history as a whole, by the way, is, like, symbols of power and legitimacy. You know, when Aegon was crowned, they did it in the Dragon Pit, and they gave him Blackfire, the sword of Aegon the Conqueror, and they did it with the crown of Aegon the Conqueror, and they did it with so many people around, and they got the High Septon to come and anoint him as the ruler. They wanted to give him all of the symbols of legitimacy, of rulership as possible. And now, you know, Rhaenyra is trying to gather all of those symbols to herself. And she talks to the High Septon, and he refuses. She says, you know, I was anointed by the gods. But he's like, yeah, I don't really care about the dragons. The dragons aren't part of my faith. I've got a different thing. Which just reminds you that, you know, the Targaryens, they're part of Westerosi society, but they are kind of this, like, foreign power that's just come and crouched on top of them. There's a line in Night of the Seven Kingdoms, can't remember which character it is, but he basically says, hey, these guys are aliens. Targaryens are literal foreign alien invaders. They are weird incest people. Why don't people talk about that more? And he's kind of right, you know. High Septon says that dragons were made from lust and greed and blood magic, and we don't know in the lore where dragons came from, but there are little hints that maybe was some kind of blood magic, possibly, you know, lusty sexual stuff as well. It's hardly like the Targaryens are particularly afraid of that. But the most significant development in this episode is definitely the split with Corlys Velaryon. He asks Rhaenyra to legitimize his 2 bastard sons, because he has lost everything and everyone. All of his kids, his wife, his fortune, his home, his fleet, his power, his gold. He's lost everything. All he has is a name now. And he got into this war for her, but also because he wanted to put his name into the history books. And if he's lost everything, if he becomes a nobody by the end of this, if he can't even pass that on to anyone, what would all of this even be for? And Rhaenyra refuses. She refuses because, again, there's that political reality. She herself has been dogged by these accusations of her kids being bastards for years, and so if one of her first acts as queen on the Iron Throne is to legitimize a couple of other bastards, I mean, that's optically just not good. And worse, these new dragon riders, Ulf and Hugh, you know, they're bastards as well. Overall, it's just going to give this impression that, you know, we are the party of bastards. We are the party of the people who don't believe in traditional marriage and your way of living, right? And if she's trying to improve her optics, her image, that's just not on the cards. Corlys is basically her second most important ally after Daemon, and this is the first thing that she's asked of him. And by the way, remember, he still possibly thinks that she murdered Laenor. Putting that aside, the story likes to play with this idea that, hey, we've got dragons, we've got unlimited power, we can destroy anything, but ultimately, our weaknesses come from other things. Martin's stories love to kind of juxtapose the absolute power of dragons with, you know, the reality of trying to maintain your allies and your friends and your resources and all that sort of thing, and seeing how that can undermine you even if you have all of the power in the world. And Corlys snaps in this episode. He says what Vaemond did a couple of seasons back and it publicly accuses her kids of being bastards. And remember, Vaemond lost his head for that, or at least part of his head, so we will see what happens to Corlys. Will she be brutal enough to get rid of someone who is her greatest ally but has publicly accused her in this way, shape or form? Or will she leave it be? For a war that is so often turned on whoever has the biggest dragon, all of this destruction and havoc that they've wreaked really brings on more important questions. How do you hold a city on the brink? How do you get people to be loyal? Because at the end of it all, when everything is burned to the ground, it's the answers to those questions that will determine who sits on the Iron Throne.